Most players get suspended and disappear. Matt Cooke got suspended and came back worse.
This guy deliberately tries to hurt people, and for him not to have a suspension is beyond me.
The hits weren't accidents. They were a system. Rules were created. He broke those too. They called him untouchable until the league had no choice left. This is how the NHL finally ran out of excuses. Matt Cooke was drafted 144th overall by the Vancouver Canucks in 1997, the kind of pick teams make and quietly forget about. A 6th-round selection who was too small to be an enforcer, not skilled enough to be a scorer, and fighting every single day just to justify his spot on a roster. For 9 seasons and roughly 600 NHL games across Vancouver and Washington, he built himself into exactly what teams needed on a third line. A checking winger who killed penalties, won puck battles in the corners. In that entire stretch, he received exactly 1 suspension in February 2004 for a spearing infraction. 1 suspension in 600 games. Whatever people would later say about Matt Cooke, the early record simply doesn't support the idea that he was born dirty. Then he arrived in Pittsburgh in the summer of 2008, signed as a free agent by a Penguins team built around Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, 2 of the most gifted offensive players of their generation. In that environment, Cooke's value was never going to come from scoring. Management made it clear. His job was to protect the Stars, disrupt opponents, and do whatever it took to stay in the lineup. The internal instruction was to play on edge. Hockey code for doing the uncomfortable things that skilled players won't do, pushing right up to the line between physical and dangerous. The problem was that nobody told Cooke exactly where that line was. And what happened next exposed a hole in the rulebook that nobody knew existed. Within months of joining Pittsburgh, the incidents started stacking up fast. In November 2008, he elbowed Rangers defenseman Artem Anisimov in the head, resulting in a 2-game suspension. In January 2009, he delivered a headshot to Carolina's Scott Walker, another 2-game suspension. During the 2009 playoffs, he kicked Detroit's Chris Osgood in the head and received nothing. Knee-on-knee hits on Eric Cole and Zach Bogosian drew no supplemental discipline whatsoever. What matters here is not just the list of incidents. It's what the league's response revealed about the system itself. 2 games, nothing. For a borderline roster player whose entire value is built on physical intimidation, a 2-game suspension was not a deferral. It was the price of admission. The NHL's disciplinary structure at the time had no framework for repeat offenders who operated below the threshold of catastrophic injury. As long as the victims got back up, the punishment stayed small. By the start of the 2009-10 season, Cooke had accumulated 2 suspensions and a growing file at the league office, but no meaningful accountability was attached to any of it. Players around the league started to warn each other about him specifically before games. And somewhere inside that Pittsburgh locker room, the version of Matt Cooke that the NHL would spend the next several years desperately trying to contain was becoming fully formed. Until the night of March 7th, 2010, when everything that had been quietly building finally landed on one man's head, and the entire sport was forced to confront what it had allowed to happen. Marc Savard was in his 782nd NHL game the night everything changed. A near point-per-game center for the Boston Bruins, one of the most creative playmakers in the league, at the absolute peak of his career. On March 7th, 2010, late in the 3rd period of a Bruins-Penguins game in Pittsburgh, Savard carried the puck into the zone, released a shot, and in the fraction of a second after the puck left his stick, Cooke came through his blind side and drove his left arm into Savard's head. Savard hit the ice and didn't move. He was unconscious for 29 seconds. He left on a stretcher with a grade 2 concussion while the building went quiet.
Well, I mean, I know that he's shooting the puck, but I just finished my check. I got hit the same way my shift before at center ice by their defenseman.
He played 7 playoff games that spring, clearly not himself, pushing through symptoms he had no business playing with. The following season, he returned for 25 games before a routine bump along the boards in Colorado, a clean, ordinary hockey play, ended his career for good. His brain simply could not absorb another impact. The years that followed were defined not by hockey, but by chronic headaches, depression, light sensitivity, and memory loss. Savard himself described it in the Players' Tribune. The anguish of not knowing what was going to become of my life and my identity was worse than all the terrible headaches. He officially retired in 2018, 8 years after that night in Pittsburgh. What made this moment historic was not just what happened to Savard, it was what the NHL did about it. No penalty was called on the ice, no suspension was issued. Not because the league didn't care, but because the rulebook had no language to cover this specific type of hit. Commissioner Gary Bettman admitted it publicly. I was very unhappy and upset with that hit. I was more upset that there was nothing in the league rules to do to punish it. The NHL's head of discipline at the time, Colin Campbell, was later exposed through leaked emails to have privately called Savard that little fake artist and the biggest faker going, context that made the league's silence on Cooke even harder to defend. Just 17 days after the hit, on March 25, 2010, the NHL introduced Rule 48, officially banning lateral and blindside hits to the head. It was a direct and explicit response to what Cooke had done to Savard. The league had just rewritten its rulebook because of one player. It made no difference. Less than a year after Rule 48 was introduced, he hit Columbus Blue Jackets defenseman Fedor Tyutin from behind on February 9, 2011, sending him face first into the boards. The NHL suspended him 4 games, his 4th career suspension overall, and the 3rd since joining Pittsburgh. What was different this time was the reaction from the players. Hockey has an unwritten code about publicly calling out opponents by name, but that code broke down around Matt Cooke in the days after the Tyutin hit. Players across the league were done staying quiet. The anger was no longer just in the locker rooms. It was in press conferences and media scrums directed specifically at him by name. Standing on the other side of all of it, largely unchanged, was Matt Cooke. But what came next would make everything before it look minor by comparison. On March 20th, 2011, in a nationally televised NBC afternoon game between Pittsburgh and the New York Rangers, Matt Cooke elbowed Ryan McDonagh directly in the head along the boards in the 3rd period of a tied game. It was not subtle. In front of a national audience, Cooke stuck his elbow out and caught McDonagh flush. He was ejected. The Rangers scored 4 unanswered goals and won. The NHL handed down its harshest response yet. Suspended for the final 10 regular season games and the entire first round of the playoffs, a minimum of 14 games, and the longest suspension of his career. He forfeited $220,000 in salary. But the suspension was almost secondary to what happened inside the Penguins organization. For the first time, his own team turned on him publicly. GM Ray Shero released a statement that pulled no punches. The suspension is warranted because that's exactly the kind of hit we're trying to get out of the game. We've told Matt in no uncertain terms that this kind of action on the ice is unacceptable and cannot happen. Owner Mario Lemieux, who had publicly campaigned for the league to clean up dangerous play, sat Cooke down personally and made the choice simple: change your game, or you are finished in Pittsburgh. What made this moment cut deeper than any of the suspensions before it was the damage Cooke was doing to his own teammates. Pittsburgh was already without Sidney Crosby, sidelined since January with a concussion, and Evgeny Malkin lost for the season to a knee injury. Cooke's public response acknowledged the weight of it. I realize and I understand, more so now than ever, that I need to change. I made a mistake, and I'm the one who's accountable for that. The suspension and the ultimatum from Lemieux pushed Cooke toward 2 of the cleanest seasons of his career, but the story was still not over. At the point when Pittsburgh visited Ottawa on February 13, 2013, Erik Karlsson was arguably the best defenseman in the entire NHL that season. He was leading all defensemen in points, playing at a level that had already earned him the Norris Trophy the previous year as the league's top defenseman. Late in the 2nd period, Cooke and Karlsson tangled along the boards. Cooke lost his balance, and as he fell, his skate blade came down on the back of Karlsson's left leg, lacerating his Achilles tendon. Surgery the following day confirmed a 70% tear. The initial recovery estimate was 6 months. This is where the story became something more than one player's pattern of reckless behavior. There was no elbow, no blindside hits, no targeting of the head. Rule 48 covered none of what just happened because what had just happened was a skate blade, and the rulebook had no language for it. The NHL's Department of Player Safety reviewed the incident and issued 0 suspension because, under the existing rules, they could find nothing illegal to punish. Senators coach Paul McLean did not hide his feelings. We all know who's involved in it. That's just the way it is. Carlson was more direct. Speaking through a media scrum with his leg in a cast, he said, "He knows exactly what he is doing out there. That is why I am sitting here with my leg in a cast." For the first time since Cooke had become the league's most controversial player, the anger in hockey was not only aimed at him, it was aimed squarely at the NHL itself. At a system that had been reactive at every turn, that had written rules in response to injuries rather than preventing them, and that had just watched the best defenseman in the game leave on crutches with no punishment to show for it. The league was now on trial. What the Carlson incident forced the NHL to confront was a timeline it could no longer explain away. Rule 48 had been introduced in March 2010 after Savard. It was expanded in 2011-12 to cover all targeted head contact regardless of angle or direction. And yet, February 2013 had still happened because the rulebook still had no answer for a skate blade. 3 years later, multiple rule revisions, and multiple careers later, the league was still one step behind the same player. The admission that followed was as close as a professional sports league ever gets to acknowledging institutional failure. Former Penguins GM Ray Shero captured the absurdity of it with striking clarity years later. It was like the Untouchables and Al Capone. What, were they going to get Matt Cooke on tax evasion? There was nothing in the rulebook. What Rule 48 ultimately became, through all its iterations, was the foundation of how the NHL now handles dangerous play across the board. Every protection that exists today for players in vulnerable positions traces back to Marc Savard lying motionless on the ice in Pittsburgh. Gary Bettman had called the original rule a fundamental shift, and it was, but only after the sport paid an enormous price to get there. The redemption story that hockey had quietly accepted fell apart in April 2014. After 2 genuinely clean seasons in Pittsburgh, Cooke had signed a 3-year, $7.5 million contract with the Minnesota Wild in 2013. Then, in the first round of the 2014 playoffs, he delivered a knee-on-knee hit on Colorado Avalanche defenseman Tyson Barrie and received a 7-game suspension. Everything the league, his teammates, and the public had chosen to believe about his transformation collapsed in a single play. Minnesota bought out his contract in June 2015. He played his last NHL game that same season. 16 years, 1,046 games, and 1,135 penalty minutes. When the rules changed and the dirty plays stopped producing an advantage, his behavior shifted. The system did what years of punishment could not. Cooke reflected on it himself. At the time, to survive the game, I felt like Matt Cooke, the player, was the guy that made the middle of the ice harder for people to get to. Marc Savard never received a call. Years after his career ended, he told the Boston Globe simply, "I wasn't in any mood to talk to him that night, so I never talked to him. I never heard from him." Matt Cooke didn't set out to change hockey. He set out to keep his job. But in doing so, he exposed every crack in a system that had no answer for him and forced the league to build something better. Rule 48 exists because of what happened to Marc Savard. The players it protects today will never know his name. Savard does. He still lives with what that night in Pittsburgh cost him. If this story kept you watching, you are exactly who Skates and Scars is built for. The stories behind the game that never make the highlight reel. Hit subscribe so you never miss one.